Now let's move on to today's perspective. And one of the distressing images of the summer was that of the 400 or so elephants found dead in Botswana with initially no apparent cause. Now, poisoning was feared, but now the government there says it believes they died from ingesting toxins produced by algae. Now, the reasons those toxins were produced could well be climate change. The temperature's changing once again, affecting not only the way we live and exist, but also the animals and nature around us. The impact of climate change on biodiversity, then, is one of the areas being tackled, of course, by scientists. And joining us from Cardiff in Wales is biologist and activist Niall McCann. Thanks very much for being with us on the programme today. Let's start off by talking about those elephants that we saw there. I mean, there's still a lot to prove in this case, isn't it? But once again, climate change could well be to blame.
You're right. So thank you for having me. It's nice to speak to you. And you're very right to say that there's still a lot to prove. There was some very hasty headlines written last week saying mystery solved, and that's a little bit ahead of the curve somewhat. So what we do know is that these harmful algal blooms have been identified in the region. That is a very important piece of the puzzle for trying to find out what has killed these elephants, but we can't yet prove that that is what killed them unless you identify those toxins in the brains of the dead animals. And of course, we're now 4 months on from when they all died, and those bodies have decomposed.
So bearing that in mind, how easy or how difficult is it to link it to climate change?
It's actually very easy, unfortunately. As with all of these things, such as your previous story about the wildfires in the western coast of the United States, climate change is your threat amplifier. It takes existing phenomena and it makes them larger and more likely and more frequent. And what's happening with these harmful algal blooms is that the warming temperatures encourage these algae to proliferate, and they then bloom in numbers that are able to overwhelm animals that are consuming them. And we've seen this before in several species. Most notably, we saw a mass die-off of an animal called the Saiga antelope in Central Asia, with a type of bacteria, Pasteurella bacterium, that normally lives totally harmlessly within the bodies of the Saiga. But climate change there encouraged these bacteria to proliferate in numbers that overwhelmed these animals, and we lost 200,000 in a year. And bear in mind, there's only 50,000 of them left.
And you've been lucky enough to kind of follow the experiences that have been going on. I mean, obviously they're horrific experiences, but you've been able to kind of travel around the world and see some of these things firsthand as well, haven't you?
That's right. So, yeah, lucky enough is an interesting choice of phrase. I've been hugely privileged to travel to these places and see wonderful wildlife, but then I've also had the trauma, I suppose, of seeing horrendous suffering happening. And with elephants, there's something different to with most animals because they're so intelligent, they are so socially connected, that when you visit the body of a dead elephant, as I've done many, many times, you notice that there's the footprints and the spores of so many other elephants around it because they come and they visit their dead and they pay tribute to them. And what that means is that with the deaths of what is probably 600 or 700 elephants in Botswana this summer, that's 600 or 700 bereavements that have happened there. And the other elephants that were related or friends with those ones that have died, they will be terrified. And that's why they've fled the region. They're no longer dying, not because this has gone away. They're no longer dying because they have fled where all of their friends and family were dying.
And the research is pretty desperate, isn't it? I mean, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a UN report that we reported on the channel, which said that all 20 international biodiversity targets were missed. This was a major report, comes out every 5 years, came up with all sorts of targets. Every single one of them, all 20 missed.
Yeah, and it's an indictment on our species, and it's an indictment on our political system. And that's the issue. We have the resources and we have the capacity to be able to roll back the negative impacts of climate change. We don't yet have the political will. What COVID-19 has done, which nothing has before, not the wildfires, not the floods, not anything, is it has explicitly made the link between our treatment of the natural world and our survival as a species ourselves. COVID-19 was caused by a breakdown in conservation, and it's going to cost the world in the region of $10 trillion and probably more. Look at the knock-on impacts of the wildfires and the amount that they cost. It's not as though it costs too much to conserve things. It costs too much not to conserve them. It's far better to find a prevention than a cure, and I believe that the G20 are just starting to wake up to this.
Will it actually make any difference, though? I mean, there's a terrible frustration, isn't there, that we'll all just, once coronavirus starts dying down a bit, hopefully it will at some point, we'll just all go back to our normal lives and forget about it all again, and the elephants will keep dying.
That is always a concern, and it's part of the human condition that we have a terrible propensity for forgetting all of these things. History is the same damn thing over and over again, as they say. One of the big issues is the type of government that we have in power at the moment. So right-wing populists are a disaster for the planet. And even in the UK, we have an element of right-wing populism, but we do have a very, very strong team in the Environment Ministry, and they are ramming through a lot of policy, and that is what's required. Everybody needs to act themselves. We can all take personal responsibility, but what really makes the difference is governments changing. And there's a couple of big events coming up. There's the climate change event, International Symposium, which has been hosted by the UK, and there's one on biodiversity, which has been hosted by China. These provide little waypoints, which I hope international governments will be using as an opportunity to roll out their new pro-environment policies. Signs are positive for the time being, but there's a lot of negative inertia to be fighting against as well.
But to get those governments to change, of course, you've got to get people to vote for them. I mean, a lot of people are still voting for the kind of governments which you say are doing the harm. It's getting individuals to change their mindset as well, isn't it?
You're very right. Yeah, we all have individual responsibility, and the simplest thing we can do is vote sensibly. If you're voting for somebody that is harming the environment, you are voting to harm the environment. And it's interesting seeing polls of voter preferences over the last few years. Climate change is rising up and up the agenda, and I believe biodiversity loss will do the same too. These things they've been hidden to begin with because of the insidious impacts of business and many governments. They've hidden the reality of climate change. They've hidden the reality of biodiversity loss. But now that we are being faced with the realities of climate change, if we look at everything that we're living through, you can no longer forget that. And voters are starting to realise that this is important to them. I just hope they remember when they're in the voting booth, as opposed to just when they're chatting around the dinner table.
Now, I'm going to finish with a sort of more personal question, if you like. Where does this passion come from in you? I mean, we've seen that passion come across in what you're saying there. I mean, there's a bit of a history, isn't there, in the family, which brings this to the forefront with you?
There is. My grandfather and my mum's dad was a glaciologist, and of course that's a dying industry as all the glaciers start to melt away. Both of my parents were biologists. My dad was the head of seal research for the British Antarctic Survey. My mum has worked on wildlife all across the world, from East Africa to the Western Hemisphere and many places in between. And both of my brothers also did zoology degrees, so it's very much a family passion. But I believe everybody should be passionate. All children love wildlife. They love wildlife and they love the natural world. And then something changes when we go through puberty and we become really cynical. And I guess I never went through that same level of development as many people. And I've retained that childhood passion, and I hope other people do too.
Great to hear that passion coming across on the television today. Thanks very much for being with us. That's Niall McCann, biologist and activist, joining us there from Cardiff in Wales. Thanks very much.